Did Tulsi Gabbard just execute the most clinical political deconstruction in American history, leaving Nancy Pelosi's 40-year legacy in ruins? Here is the jaw-dropping confrontation that left a Senate room in absolute silence. Director Gabbard, you are a Russian asset. You met with Assad. You betrayed our Democratic Party, and you serve a fascist president who sent the National Guard against American children. You should be in prison, not subpoenaing the longest-serving speaker in modern American history. Nancy Pelosi pointed her finger sharply across the Senate hearing room, using the very same hand that had sworn an oath on a Bible just 10 minutes earlier. Adam Schiff sat beside her, nodding solemnly. Tulsi Gabbard did not flinch. She sat perfectly still, a combat journal resting in her left hand, a sealed manila envelope sitting ominously on the table before her. Pelosi had just made a profound mistake. What unfolded over the next 2 hours completely dismantled Nancy Pelosi's legacy on live C-SPAN. You are about to witness the most absolute, clinical, political deconstruction in the history of modern American congressional hearings. The scene was set inside the Hart Senate Office Building, Hearing Room 216, at precisely 1:00 on a Tuesday morning in April. The cameras from C-SPAN and Fox News were rolling live. The viewing galleries had been packed to capacity since 7:00 inches the morning. Half of the audience proudly wore AOC buttons and union shirts, while the other half was comprised of military veterans, Capitol Police widows, and 3 former intelligence officers who had quietly returned to service during the second Trump term. Senator Tom Cotton sat at the center of the dais. To his left was the witness table where an 85-year-old Nancy Pelosi had just been sworn in, dressed in a cream Armani pantsuit and wearing a signature single strand of 26 pearls that she had worn for 30 years. Adam Schiff sat faithfully beside her as her personal counsel. To Cotton's right sat the second witness, Tulsi Gabbard, 44 years old, wearing a charcoal pantsuit and combat boots barely visible beneath her trouser cuffs. An ODNI lapel pin rested on her jacket. She held a small leather field journal that had traveled in her rucksack across 2 military deployments, and next to it, a manila envelope secured with the official seal of the Director of National Intelligence. Beside her sat Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. Just 3 weeks prior, Tulsi had declassified the Inspector General files regarding the 2019 impeachment of Donald Trump. These files revealed that the foundational whistleblower complaint had been constructed on second-hand evidence and heavily biased political witnesses. Consequently, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence subpoenaed Pelosi, the very speaker who had launched that impeachment, and granted Tulsi the unprecedented authority to cross-examine her. Pelosi's jaw tightened visibly when Chairman Cotton uttered the word cross-examination. "Madam Speaker," Cotton instructed, "you may begin with your opening statement." Pelosi gripped the microphone with both hands. For the ensuing 9 minutes, she spoke with the practiced cadence she had honed over 50 years of press conferences, the rhythm of a politician who knew exactly how to deliver a soundbite for the evening news. Yet, it was also the cadence of a woman who, until that very morning, had never sat in a witness chair under the absolute bind of an oath. She labeled Donald Trump the Mussolini of Mar-a-Lago. She condemned the Republican Party as a death cult parading in the American flag. She claimed the Department of Justice had been aggressively weaponized against her, against Senator Schiff, and against every citizen who had voted against Trump, framing it as a campaign of political revenge entirely unprecedented in American history. Then, she turned her gaze slowly to lock eyes with Tulsi Gabbard. "Director Gabbard," she stated, her eyes unblinking, "I want to be very clear about who you are. You are not a credible figure in the intelligence community. You spent the last decade defending Bashar Assad, a man who gassed his own children." She accused Gabbard of parroting Russian propaganda to the point that even Mitt Romney labeled her traitorous, noting that the Senate had barely confirmed her in a tight 52-48 vote. "Half this body considers you a national security risk," Pelosi declared, lifting a single finger in accusation. "You met with Assad in 2017, secretly, without authorization. You promoted Edward Snowden, a fugitive who stole classified materials. You sat on Tucker Carlson's couch and questioned American biolabs in Ukraine, repeating Kremlin disinformation word for word. Her finger remained leveled across the room. And now you have weaponized the office of the Director of National Intelligence to declassify documents selectively and conveniently just to attack the very institutions that protected this country from Donald Trump in 2019. Her voice echoed through the chamber, clearly playing to the progressive half of the gallery who leaned in closer. You are a Russian asset who betrayed the Democratic Party. You met with a war criminal. You should be in prison, and you should not be here questioning me. History will see right through this. Adam Schiff nodded along, just as he had been doing the entire time. A scattered burst of applause erupted from the left side of the gallery, instantly silenced by the heavy strike of Senator Cotton's gavel. Order in the room, Cotton warned. Director Gabbard, you may proceed with cross-examination. Tulsi did not reply right away. She simply looked at the sealed manila envelope. She looked at Pelosi. The tension in the room thickened until it was almost breathable. When she finally spoke, her voice was much quieter, much more measured than Pelosi's had been. Madam Speaker, Tulsi began calmly, I came here today not to debate. I came to read. She rested her right hand on the envelope and deliberately broke the seal. If you are listening to this unfold, pay close attention, because you are about to hear what happens when a seasoned soldier armed with hard evidence confronts a career politician bound by an oath. Tulsi withdrew the very first photograph from the envelope and set it flat on the witness table. She didn't slide it toward Pelosi immediately. She allowed the network cameras to zoom in and capture it first. It was a stark booking photo, a mugshot originating from the state of California, Napa County Sheriff's Department. The man in the glaring photograph was an 82-year-old white male, his hair disheveled in that distinct, chaotic way that only happens at 30 inches the morning in the back seat of a police cruiser. His eyes were bloodshot red, and a booking number was clearly printed across his chest. The man was Paul Pelosi. Pelosi recognized the image a fraction of a second before the camera operators fully focused on it. Her hand instinctively darted to her pearl necklace. The first twist of the thread. Madam Speaker, Tulsi said, her tone level, before we discuss the impeachment of 2019, I want to ask you a question about a completely different night. May 28, 2022. Do you remember exactly where you were that night? I was abroad. Pelosi stammered slightly. Where, Madam Speaker? A brief hesitation. Brussels. And what were you doing in Brussels? Tulsi pressed. I was meeting with NATO leadership, reaffirming the American commitment to the rules-based international order. Pelosi answered defensively. Could you describe to this committee what you ate that night, Madam Speaker? Adam Schiff abruptly leaned into his microphone. Mr. Chairman, the relevance of what the Speaker had for dinner. Tulsi didn't even grant Schiff a glance. She kept her eyes locked entirely on Pelosi. Madam Speaker, I will gladly tell you what you ate. The State Department per diem records indicate your delegation hosted a lavish working dinner at the Circle Royal Gaulois. The dinner featured 6 courses, there was flowing champagne, there were formal toasts. The dinner concluded at 11:00 Brussels time. Tulsi paused, letting the timeline sink in. It was 20 inches the afternoon in Napa, California, when your dinner ended. Madam Speaker, what was happening in Napa, California, while you were raising toasts with NATO? Pelosi offered no response. Madam Speaker, while you were raising a glass with the Belgian foreign minister, your 82-year-old husband was sitting in the back of a California Highway Patrol cruiser. He had just been pulled from the twisted wreckage of a Porsche. The vehicle was registered to you. He had been driving under the severe influence of alcohol. Tulsi let the silence hang before delivering the next detail. There was a passenger in the seat right next to him. She let the word passenger marinate in the quiet room for 2 full seconds. The passenger was a woman. The passenger was not a member of your family. The passenger was not a member of your staff. The Napa County District Attorney's report, which is a matter of public record, explicitly identifies the passenger as, and I quote, the document directly, a personal companion of the suspect, end quote. The progressive half of the viewing gallery fell completely, uncomfortably silent. Madam Speaker, While you were in Brussels grandstanding about the rules-based international order, your husband was being arrested in Napa with another woman inside your car. Pelosi's hand twisted the pearls twice more. Director, this is a private, personal matter regarding my husband's medical situation. Medical situation, Madam Speaker? Tulsi flipped the second photograph face up. It was the official police report. The blood alcohol level was circled at the top of the page in glaring red ink 0.082, clearly above the legal limit. The vehicle make Porsche 911. The location, the intersection of Walnut Lane and Oakville Crossroad. The time 10:12 in the evening. The arresting officer's typed narrative noted that Paul Pelosi had actively attempted to present a card identifying himself as a Department of Defense contractor. He was, in fact, not a Department of Defense contractor. He held absolutely no such security authorization. The card was a desperate prop, the kind of object a wealthy man pulls out at 30 inches the morning to intimidate a patrolman and avoid being thrown in a holding cell. Madam Speaker, Tulsi stated, her voice slicing through the room, your husband tried to flash a fake federal credential at a California state trooper to weasel out of a drunk driving arrest with another woman in the passenger seat. The silence that washed over the hearing room was the profound silence of an audience discovering the other woman detail for the very first time. The Pelosi PR machine had successfully buried that specific fact for 4 long years through an aggressive combination of media pressure, sealed court records, and the chilling reality that no journalist wanted to risk their career by asking the question. Schiff desperately tried to intervene again. Mr. Chairman, the impeachment subpoena absolutely does not authorize. Tulsi finally turned her head to look at him. Her voice did not raise a single decibel. Senator Schiff, the cross-examination authority explicitly granted by this committee, covers any and all matters relating directly to the credibility of the witness. Drunk driving with a personal companion, in the family vehicle of a sitting Speaker of the House, while she supposedly conducts high-level diplomacy in Brussels, speaks volumes to the credibility of the woman who launched a presidential impeachment based entirely on a phone call she never actually heard. Sir, please instruct your client to answer the question. Schiff opened his mouth to argue, closed it, and looked helplessly at Pelosi. Pelosi refused to look back at him. Cotton slammed the gavel. The objection is overruled. Director Gabbard, please continue. Tulsi didn't dwell on Paul Pelosi's embarrassment. She moved straight to the systemic corruption. Madam Speaker, your husband was ultimately sentenced to just 5 days in the Napa County Jail. 5 days. That was framed as the maximum sentence under the law. A law you personally co-sponsored. A law you proudly stood next to Mothers Against Drunk Driving to sign into existence in 2007. However, the actual statutory maximum was 6 months. Tulsi withdrew a third sheet of paper. I have here the record of a blue-collar construction worker in San Joaquin County. He was convicted of a first-offense DUI in May of 2022, the exact same month your husband was arrested. This working man served 60 days in jail. He lost his commercial driver's license for an entire year. He lost his stable job at the local rendering plant. His wife subsequently filed for divorce in October. Their 2 young children were forced to move in with his elderly mother in Stockton. He has not been legally allowed to drive a truck since. His name is fully documented in the public court record. She looked deeply at Pelosi. His name is not in this folder because he is not the issue here. The central issue is that your wealthy husband served 5 days, while the construction worker served 60. The written law was exactly the same. She placed the document firmly on the wood. Madam Speaker, tell this committee what kind of America operates with 2 entirely different sets of laws, one for the privileged husband of the Speaker, and a devastating one for the man who drives the truck. The pearls endured a third violent twist. Pelosi's trembling right hand reached for her water glass. The crystal shook visibly, splashing slightly. She didn't drink. She merely set it back down. I cannot possibly speak to local sentencing decisions. That was entirely under the prosecutor's discretion. The prosecutor in Napa County, Madam Speaker, was your direct political donor. Tulsi's delivery was devastatingly quick. His official campaign disclosure forms are right here in this folder. He received exactly $14,000 from the Pelosi for Congress Political Committee between the years 2016 and 2022. He received this money in the exact same county where your husband wrecked his car and where his booking photo was taken. Pelosi briefly closed her eyes. It was only for a half second, but the high-def cameras caught the defeat. Madam Speaker, the construction worker in Stockton simply did not have a political action committee to buy his freedom. The gallery did not erupt in applause. This was a formal Senate hearing. But a woman in the back row wearing a Lebanon pin brought a trembling hand to her mouth in shock, and the veterans seated in the second row leaned intensely forward in their heavy wooden chairs. Tulsi didn't afford Pelosi a moment to breathe between rounds. She reached deep into the envelope and extracted the second folder. It was bright green. The official seal at the very top clearly read, U.S. House of Representatives Office of the Clerk Financial Disclosure Reports. Madam Speaker, we will now turn our attention to the perplexing question of how a public servant earning a taxpayer salary of $174,000 a year somehow miraculously accumulates a staggering personal fortune in excess of $250 million. She opened the green folder. Inside, there were no complicated charts, no dizzying graphs, no PowerPoint printouts. There was merely a single piece of white paper bearing a single typed sentence. She read it aloud. Madam Speaker, when you first took your seat in the United States Congress back in 1987, your family's total net worth was estimated at roughly $3 million. Today, your family is worth anywhere between $250 million and $400 million. The exact astronomical figure depends entirely on how the Napa Valley winery is currently valued. The silence that blanketed the room shifted in quality. It became the heavy, focused silence of 300 people simultaneously doing the grotesque math in their heads. Madam Speaker, tell this Senate committee, how exactly does that happen? My husband is a seasoned businessman. Pelosi deflected quickly. Paul has extensive ventures in capital and real estate. Paul runs financial leasing services, a San Francisco firm, Tulsi countered. The firm's primary income source is commercial real estate and completely legal stock trading, specifically call options on major technology companies. Tulsi did not pull out an exhaustingly long list of suspicious stock trades. She did not name the specific tech companies. Instead, she pulled out a single photograph. It was a breathtaking, wide-angle shot of a sprawling hillside in Napa Valley. Endless rows of manicured grapevines stretched from the foreground straight into a golden sunset. In the dead center of the idyllic image sat a massive stone and redwood villa with a Mediterranean tile roof, the exact type of sprawling estate that graces the cover of Architectural Digest under the headline A Family's Legacy in Wine Country. This is your primary home and street, Helena, Madam Speaker. The Pelosi family vineyard, 10 acres of premium land purchased in 2009. The initial purchase price was a modest $16 million. The current market valuation is hovering closer to $30 million. Then she pulled out a second photograph. This one was taken from a drastically different perspective, approximately 12 inches above the dirty concrete sidewalk on Market Street in San Francisco. The camera angle was exceedingly low because the freelance photographer had been kneeling in the filth. The image captured a frail man wearing a tattered green army field jacket fast asleep on a bed of flattened wet cardboard. His worn combat boots were lined up perfectly beside his makeshift bed. A tiny American flag, the exact kind handed out at military funerals, had been carefully tucked into the frayed laces of one boot. Madam Speaker, this is a man named Robert Holcomb. He is 78 years old. He served 2 brutal tours in Vietnam. He was photographed on the corner of Market and 7th Streets on December 18, 2025, just 6 weeks ago. The journalist positively confirmed his identity through his VA medical records. Mr. Holcomb has lived on the unforgiving pavement of Market Street for 3 long years. He sleeps every single night, within a mere 40-minute drive of your luxurious $30 million vineyard. Tulsi laid the 2 wildly contrasting photographs side by side on the witness table. the $30 million villa looming above the vines, sitting adjacent to the forgotten veteran freezing on the cardboard. She didn't need to utter another word about it. The broadcast cameras did all the devastating emotional work. The combat veterans sitting in the second row were no longer leaning forward. They were sitting rigidly, terrifyingly still. Madam Speaker, 6,000 human beings will sleep on the freezing streets of your district tonight. Your home district boasts the highest per capita homelessness rate of any congressional district in the entire United States. The public charity tax records show that you and your husband have donated a total of $3 million to homeless services across an incredibly lucrative 8-year career. That figure represents exactly 1% of your vast net worth. The average American household, the very families you consistently claim to champion and fight for, gives 2.1%. The struggling working folks in your own district give far more proportionally to charity than you do. Schiff, furious, lunged toward his microphone to object. Tulsi snapped her attention to him before he could even speak a word. Senator Schiff, your own public financial disclosure reveals a personal net worth of $16 million, somehow accumulated entirely on a fixed congressional salary. This includes a $1 million vacation home in Burbank that you miraculously purchased just 4 short months after voting favorably on motion picture industry tax credits. Sir, I possess a dedicated folder for you as well. It is resting inside this envelope. It is not on today's official agenda, but I swear to you, if you intervene one more time, I will open it. Schiff froze. He slowly sat back in his chair. He didn't sit back with the resigned posture of a lawyer whose objection had been formally overruled. He sat back with a cold, sinking realization of a man who suddenly understands for the first time in years that he is utterly powerless in the room. The viewing gallery noticed. The rolling cameras noticed. Chairman Cotton noticed, allowing himself a fleeting half-second smirk before returning to an expression of stone. Tulsi pivoted back to Pelosi. Madam Speaker, in 1987, you stood proudly on the floor of the House and stated, and I quote from your maiden speech, "I came here to fight for the working families of San Francisco." End quote. She tapped a finger firmly against the tragic photograph of Robert Holcomb shivering in his Army field jacket on the dirty cardboard. This is a working family, Madam Speaker. He worked breaking his back for 31 years as a longshoreman after he returned home from the jungles of Vietnam. His entire pension was wiped out when the Longshoremen's Fund tragically collapsed during the 2008 financial crisis. He has been desperately waiting 14 years for federal pension protection legislation, the Pension Protection Act of 2022, a bill which would have fully restored his rightful payments, passed the Senate with a bipartisan 68-32 vote. It died a quiet death in the House because you, Madam Speaker, flatly refused to bring it to a floor vote. The excuse provided by your office at the time was, and I quote, your communications director, scheduling conflicts with end-of-session business, end quote. Tulsi slowly closed the green folder. Madam Speaker, the man freezing on the cardboard is the working family you solemnly swore you came here to fight for. The sprawling villa in the photograph is what you actually fought for instead. The pearls endured their 4th desperate twist. This time, the friction was too much. A single gleaming pearl pulled loose from the stress thread. It hung perilously by a fraying wisp of silk, swinging slightly back and forth. Pelosi, paralyzed, did not notice it. The water glass trembled again, but she dared not reach for it. With all due respect, Director, Pelosi rasped, Paul makes those complex investment decisions. Madam Speaker, Tulsi replied, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register, Paul Pelosi holds a basic community college degree from the University of San Francisco. He officially retired from financial leasing services in the year 2017. Miraculously, the highly lucrative, perfectly timed stock trades have continued unabated since his retirement. The trades continued during the exact months he was painfully recovering from a horrific hammer attack. The trades incredibly continued during the very weeks he was sitting in a jail cell. Tulsi leaned slightly forward. Madam Speaker, Either Paul Pelosi is secretly the absolute greatest institutional investor in modern American financial history, consistently outperforming Warren Buffett every single quarter for 15 consecutive years while incapacitated in a hospital bed and a jail cell, or someone else entirely is orchestrating these trades and simply putting his name on the paperwork. She let the devastating accusation hang in the air. Madam Speaker, tell this committee right now who is actually executing the trades in your husband's financial account. Pelosi could not form words. The suffocating silence stretched on for 9 agonizing seconds. C-SPAN's director wisely held the tight, unflinching camera shot on Pelosi's panicked face for all 9 of those seconds. Tulsi then reached for the third folder. It was pitch black. The thick cover bore no official markings. She did not open it immediately. She placed it squarely on the table and rested her open palm heavily upon it. This was the folder Pelosi truly had not seen coming. Madam Speaker, we will now discuss the turbulent events of July 2024, more specifically, the crucial 11 days stretching between July 10th and July 21st. Pelosi's mouth instantly formed a tight, bloodless line. Madam Speaker, on the morning of July 10th, 2024, you initiated a series of highly private telephone calls to key members of the House Democratic Caucus. These urgent calls concerned the faltering candidacy of President Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. The calls actively debated whether he was physically capable of winning in November. The calls aggressively pushed the narrative of whether he should be forced to abandon the race. Exactly 11 days later, on July 21st, President Joe Biden abruptly withdrew. She finally flipped open the black folder. Tucked inside was a massive, intimidating stack of printed phone records. She didn't bother reading them aloud. Madam Speaker, I am not going to bore the room by reading the call logs. I am not going to read the intercepted text messages. I am not going to read the highly sensitive, leaked memos from your personal political action committee. The American public is entirely welcome to read those documents themselves. They are now officially entered into the public record of this committee. She pushed the thick stack of papers aside and extracted a single, solitary photograph from the bottom of the folder. I am simply going to ask you to look closely at this picture. She slid the photograph across the polished oak table. Pelosi refused to pick it up. The cameras rapidly zoomed in. The photograph was vintage. The colors possessed that distinct, slightly faded, washed-out quality characteristic of 1970s film stock. A beaming man and a radiant woman stood joyfully on the front steps of an old church. The man was dressed in a sharp navy suit, proudly holding a bouquet. He was 30 years old, possessing thick, dark hair and an infectious smile. The young woman beside him wore a classic white wedding dress. She was 26 years old, her hand resting lovingly on the man's arm. Behind the happy couple, arranged on the stone church steps, stood the laughing bridesmaids. The beautiful bride was looking directly at the camera lens, and the woman standing immediately to the left of the bride, the chosen maid of honor, was a 6-year-old woman with dark brown hair wearing a pale yellow dress. The maid of honor was Nancy Pelosi. Madam Speaker, Tulsi demanded, tell this committee exactly who got married on that beautiful day. Pelosi's hand began to shake violently. The pearls trembled against her collarbone. That is Joseph and Jill Biden. June 17th, 1977. You were the maid of honor at Jill Biden's wedding, Madam Speaker. You were 37 years old. You had already known Joseph Biden for 5 years. You had known Jill Biden for 2. The deep familial friendship between the 4 of you, Paul, Nancy, Joe, Jill, was destined to last for 47 years. Tulsi immediately pulled a second photograph from the abyss of the black folder. This one was far more recent, dated 2015. It depicted a somber funeral. Beau Biden's funeral, held at St. Anthony of Padua in Wilmington, Delaware. The heartbreaking image showed an incredibly long, winding line of grief-stricken mourners standing outside the church in the pouring rain. Standing near the very front of that agonizing line, huddled in a heavy black coat, was Nancy Pelosi. She had boarded a flight from San Francisco at dawn just to be there. Madam Speaker, you attended Beau Biden's funeral. You stood faithfully with Joseph Biden in the freezing rain for 2 solid hours. You even helped write a portion of his eulogy. You called him on the phone every single Christmas for 47 consecutive years. You publicly referred to Jill Biden as your literal sister in your 2008 published memoir, the very memoir we happen to have a physical copy of right here in this committee's records, page 241. She pulled a third document. It was a photocopy of Pelosi's own memoir, opened precisely to the highlighted page. I quote your own words, "Joe is the brother I never had. Jill is the sister I never had. They have been my family in Washington for as long as I have lived here. They have been present at every birthday, every wedding, every funeral. They are not just friends, they are family." End quote. Your exact words, published in 2008. Tulsi dramatically snapped the book shut. Madam Speaker, in July of 2024, you spent 11 frantic, calculated days on the telephone systematically destroying the man you called your brother. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. You did not call him. You did not visit him. You did not possess the courage to say a single critical word to his face. Instead, you called his ambitious colleagues. You called his wealthy donors. You called the influential editorial board of the New York Times. In just 11 days, you ruthlessly orchestrated the political assassination of the very man who had wept and buried his beloved son in your arms in 2015. You did not even have the basic human decency to tell him to his face. Pelosi's lip quivered helplessly. No sound emerged. Then, in October of 2024, mere weeks before the presidential election, when it became glaringly obvious that your hand-picked replacement was plummeting toward defeat, you sat down for a remarkably candid interview with the New York Times, and you coldly stated, I quote, "Had the president gotten out sooner, there may have been other stronger candidates in the race." End quote. Tulsi let the sheer cruelty of that quote land with the weight of a physical blow for 5 agonizing seconds. Madam Speaker, you publicly blamed him just 3 weeks before the deciding vote, fully knowing that Vice President Harris was desperately campaigning on a platform of party unity. You publicly humiliated and asked to guest a loyal man you had violently shoved out the door, and you did it knowing exactly the catastrophic damage it would inflict on her flailing campaign. Madam Speaker, that was not brilliant political strategy. That was pure, unadulterated contempt. I never wanted. I love Joe. I love Jill. Pelosi choked out, her voice barely a whisper. Madam Speaker, Dr. Jill Biden has refused to speak a single word to you since November 5th, 2024. She has repeatedly refused to accept your frantic phone calls. She has flatly refused to attend the same social events. She has actively avoided being in the same room with you for 15 straight months. Last January, she granted a rare single interview to the Washington Post. The journalist asked her specifically about your storied friendship. I'm going to read exactly what she said. Tulsi withdrew the printed article, but she didn't even need to glance at the paper. She had it memorized. Quote, "We were friends for 50 years. It was disappointing." End quote. She dropped the article onto the desk. Madam Speaker, notice the past tense. Were friends. Was disappointing. The sister you so beautifully wrote about in your memoir completely refuses to consider you family anymore. The progressive section of the gallery, the hardcore supporters in the AOC pins and the union shirts, sat rigidly with their hands folded in their laps. 2 of them had openly begun to weep. They were not crying for Nancy Pelosi. They were crying for Joe Biden, the weary old man in Wilmington who had been mercilessly betrayed by the woman who had once stood proudly beside his wife in a wedding dress. A young staffer seated in the 3rd row, a black woman wearing a prominent Pelosi campaign pin, abruptly stood up in tears and walked briskly out of the hearing room. The network cameras faithfully tracked her exit. Schiff stared intensely down at his own hands. Pelosi desperately clawed at her pearls, twisting the fragile thread, letting out an audible, miserable groan directly into the hot microphone. A second pearl tore loose from the binding. Now 2 pearls hung precariously by the fraying silk, swinging violently with her every erratic movement. Director, with all due respect, President Biden's terribly difficult decision was his own. Pelosi managed to stammer. Madam Speaker, Tulsi countered with chilling precision, I have personally read Senator Schiff's text messages from those pivotal 11 days. They are a core part of the discovery materials this very committee subpoenaed. He typed the exact phrase, quote, "We have to push him out," end quote. He sent that treasonous phrase to you on the evening of July 14th. You promptly replied, quote, "Agreed, working on it," end quote. You fired off that reply to him at 1117 at night, while Joseph Biden was peacefully asleep in the residence of the White House, while Dr. Jill Biden was quietly reading in the Yellow Oval Room. While they had absolutely no idea the knife was coming, Adam Schiff buried his face completely in his hands. Madam Speaker, Donald Trump did not maliciously steal the 2024 election. You stole it right out from under your own party. You stole it from the very man who wept as he buried his son in your arms. Tulsi moved relentlessly to the fourth folder. It was colored a striking, violent red. The cover was minimally marked State of the Union, February 4th, 2020, joint session. She didn't pull out a dense list of grievances. She pulled out 4 distinct photographs, laying them methodically on the table one by one. The first photograph is a 100-year-old black man confined to a wheelchair. He was proudly wearing his decorated old military uniform. His name was Charles McGee. He had bravely flown 136 harrowing combat sorties during World War II with the legendary Tuskegee Airmen. When he returned home from fighting for freedom, he was told he wasn't allowed to eat at the very lunch counter at the airfield where he had tirelessly trained. He had lived through a century of struggle. He had watched his entire country evolve. On the night this specific photograph was taken, he was sitting honorably in the gallery of the United States House of Representatives, watching the President of the United States proudly announce his long-overdue promotion to the esteemed rank of Brigadier General. The second photograph is a 4-year-old black girl wearing a bright pink dress. Her name was Janiyah Davis. She lived in a tough neighborhood in Philadelphia. Her devoted mother had painstakingly ironed that pink dress twice that morning. They had taken 2 crowded buses and a long train ride all the way to Washington. They had been told Janiyah was receiving a scholarship. They had not been told it would be magically announced live on national television. The little girl was sitting joyfully on her weeping mother's lap when the president spoke her name, awarding her a vital federal opportunity scholarship to attend the very school her mother had been sitting on a waiting list for since Janiyah was a toddler. The third photograph is a battle-hardened Special Forces sergeant proudly wearing his Class A uniform. His name was Townsend Williams. He had just successfully completed his brutal 4th combat deployment to Afghanistan. He had not laid eyes on his beloved wife and 2 young children in 7 long months. The president had secretly arranged for him to walk out from the shadows of the cloakroom and surprise his sobbing family on live television. The breathtaking image shows him being fiercely hugged by his 2 children. His wife has her trembling hand on his back. She isn't even looking at the flashing cameras. She is staring entirely into her husband's face. Up until that very second, she had believed he was still dodging bullets in Kandahar. The fourth photograph is an older, ailing man wearing a formal tuxedo, sitting closely with his wife. His name was Rush Limbaugh. Just 2 days prior to this event, his oncologist had informed him he had stage 4 lung cancer, giving him 6 months, perhaps a year at most, to live. That night, he had attended the State of the Union having absolutely no idea the president was about to bestow upon him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. His devoted wife was sobbing openly when the heavy medal was placed around his fragile neck. His own hands were violently shaking. He died just 14 months later. Tulsi neatly arranged the 4 photographs in a perfect row across the polished witness table. Madam Speaker, on the historic night, these 4 exceptional Americans were honored on the sacred floor of the United States House of Representatives. You stood exactly 8 feet directly behind the President of the United States. And as he triumphantly concluded his speech on live television, directly in front of 40 million viewing Americans, You deliberately ripped the written speech perfectly in half. She didn't bother pulling out the infamous viral photograph of the tearing. She didn't need to. It was burned into the memory of everyone in the room. Madam Speaker, I am not going to waste time asking you why you angrily tore up the speech. You have eagerly answered that question in countless fawning interviews. You have repeatedly claimed it was, quote, the courteous thing to do, considering the alternative, end quote. I am going to ask you a very different question. She tapped the photograph of Charles McGee. Madam Speaker, when you violently tore that speech, were you consciously aware that one of the very pages you ripped cleanly in half contained the official announcement of the promotion of a heroic Tuskegee airman to brigadier general? I had not. I had not read the speech in advance. Pelosi stammered defensively, Madam Speaker, you were holding a copy. The Speaker of the House is traditionally given an advanced copy. The Speaker holds that copy throughout the entire duration of the address. The very copy you ripped was the exact copy you had been holding and reviewing. Pelosi fell silent. Madam Speaker, were you completely unaware that one of the pages you vindictively tore awarded a life-changing federal scholarship to a 4-year-old black girl from Philadelphia? Silence. Tulsi tapped the beaming photograph of Janiah Davis. Madam Speaker, Janiah Davis is 10 years old now. She still lives in Philadelphia. She currently attends a public charter school, the exact one her exhausted mother fought tooth and nail to enroll her in. After the generous federal scholarship, the president announced that night was immediately tied up in bitter litigation for 2 agonizing years. That partisan litigation was aggressively pushed by the District of Columbia and Pennsylvania attorneys general, both loyal Democrats who spitefully challenged the executive authority of the scholarship. Madam Speaker, do you know what little Janiah Davis tearfully asked her mother in March of 2020, just 3 short weeks after that infamous broadcast? Dead silence. She heartbreakingly asked her mother, quote, did the lady not want me to go to school? End quote. She was only 4 years old. She didn't understand the complex concept of a duplicate copy. She didn't grasp the nasty nuances of political theater. She only understood that a powerful woman stood up and angrily tore up the piece of paper that had her name on it. Pelosi stared numbly down at the photograph of the little girl, unable to hold the gaze for long. Tulsi immediately tapped the 3rd photograph. Madam Speaker, Sergeant Townsend Williams, Special Forces, 4th Grueling Deployment. The sacred page you tore contained the beautiful surprise reunion with his desperate family. Were you aware? No response. Tulsi tapped the 4th photograph. Madam Speaker, Rush Limbaugh, Stage 4 lung cancer. The very page you tore proudly contained the Presidential Medal of Freedom announcement. He tragically passed away 14 months later. His grieving widow has spoken publicly about that specific night, exactly one time, in 2023, on the Mike Gallagher radio program. I am going to read exactly what she said. Tulsi pulled a single, crisp sheet of paper from the red folder. Quote, Rush watched the replay of the broadcast that night from his sterile hospital bed. He watched the speech being ripped in half. He slowly turned to me and said, that woman just tore up the page that gave me a medal. Then he actually laughed, because he was Rush. But I did not laugh. I knew he was rapidly dying, and I knew the incredibly vindictive woman standing behind the president had just torn up the only major public honor my husband would ever receive from the country he deeply loved. He never spoke of the incident again, but I think about it every single day. End quote. Catherine Limbaugh, 2023. Tulsi firmly set the paper down. Madam Speaker, in your vitriolic opening statement today, barely 58 minutes ago, you casually referred to the Republican Party as a literal death cult. You claimed conservative voters were wholly complicit in rising fascism. She swept her hand across the 4 emotional photographs. Madam Speaker, a death cult does not joyfully promote a 100-year-old black military veteran. A death cult does not award a crucial scholarship to a 4-year-old black girl. A death cult does not safely bring a weary sergeant home from Afghanistan to hug his crying children. A death cult does not place a high honor around the neck of a dying man. She locked her piercing gaze onto Pelosi. You performed the absolute only tearing in the entire chamber that night. The pearls gave way to a 5th chaotic twist. 3 more pristine pearls tore violently free of the thread. 5 pearls were now hanging dangerously by the frail silk, swinging visibly with every jagged, terrified breath Pelosi took. Pelosi desperately reached for the water glass with her trembling left hand, while her right hand remained clutched at her throat. The glass made it halfway to her lips before her shaking forced her to stop. She fumbled, setting the glass down too hard. Water sloshed heavily over the rim, spilling wildly across the polished witness table and pooling ominously around the 4 glossy photographs. She made absolutely no motion to wipe it up. Janiah Davis' bright pink dress in the photograph slowly darkened into a deep crimson wherever the spilled water touched it. Then came the final folder, the kill shot, the one she had lived in absolute terror of for 24 agonizing years. Tulsi methodically reached for the 5th and final folder. It was entirely black, accented with a stark red declassification stripe running diagonally across it. The imposing seal of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence was stamped heavily across the front. The explosive document buried inside had been tightly classified as top secret for 24 long years. She broke the heavy second seal. Madam Speaker, we will now turn to the dark morning of September 4th, 2002. Pelosi's face morphed into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. The previous revelations had inflicted political damage. This one threatened utter annihilation. Madam Speaker, on the brisk morning of September 4th, 2002, you quietly traveled to the heavily guarded headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency in Langley, Virginia. At that time, you were the powerful ranking Democrat on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. You sat through an incredibly sensitive, classified briefing. That briefing was conducted directly by the Chief Counsel of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center. It lasted for exactly 95 minutes. The sole, terrifying subject of that briefing was the brutal interrogation of a captured high-level terrorist named Abu Zubaydah. Tulsi paused, letting the historic gravity settle. Do you recall exactly what was discussed in that windowless room, Madam Speaker? I do not recall the specific. Pelosi stammered weakly. Madam Speaker, with the express, direct authorization of the President of the United States, this very committee has fully declassified the official briefing log from that secret meeting. I am holding it right now in my hand. I am about to read it permanently into the historical record. She held up the damning document. The bold top-secret stamp was viciously crossed out in thick red ink. Madam Speaker, I am going to read you exactly what was discussed in that room. I am going to utilize the precise, clinical language of the official briefing log. I highly suggest you brace yourself. Pelosi froze, paralyzed. At precisely 9:14 inches the morning, the CIA chief counsel formally began the briefing by detailing the covert apprehension of Abu Zubaydah in March of 2002. He described Mr. Zubaydah's extreme resistance to standard interrogation methods. He then clearly described, and the official briefing log uses this exact chilling phrase, enhanced interrogation techniques to be authorized for use on the subject, end quote. He explicitly listed the brutal techniques. There were 10 of them. The 10th technique, Madam Speaker, was waterboarding. Tulsi did not lift her eyes from the horrifying document. The briefing covered the grotesque application of waterboarding in excruciatingly granular detail. It described the slanted board on which the subject would be tightly strapped, the precise angle at which the cruel board would be tilted, the specific type of cloth that would be placed firmly over the suffocating subject's face, the exact volume of water that would be relentlessly poured, the duration, the terrifying frequency, the strict medical monitoring mandated during the brutal procedure, the explicit distress signs the interrogators were trained to watch for, the emergency procedure for halting the session only if the attending medical officer judged the dying subject was falling into active cardiac distress. She turned the heavy page. The official briefing log records the attendees, quote, Pelosi, N. Ranking Minority Member HPSCI present throughout duration, 95 minutes. Questions raised none. Objections recorded none. Concerns expressed about technique application, none. End quote. Tulsi snapped the document shut. Madam Speaker, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States brutally waterboarded Abu Zubaydah 83 separate times in the bloody month of August 2002. This horrific waterboarding occurred in direct, glaring violation of the UN Convention Against Torture, which the United States proudly ratified back in 1988. This gruesome waterboarding was described to you in absolute, agonizing detail a full month after it began. You sat there. You raised absolutely zero objections. You wrote zero letters of protest. You whispered it to absolutely no one in your supposedly righteous party. You drove home from Langley, and you cowardly did not speak a single word of it for 7 long years. I was assured by legal counsel that the methods Pelosi weakly attempted to deflect. Madam Speaker, in April of 2009, 7 full years later, when this horrifying story finally broke in the public press, you frantically held a massive press conference on live national television with countless reporters standing right in front of you. You stood pompously at a podium right here in this very building. You explicitly said, and I am going to quote your exact televised words, "I was not told that waterboarding was being used. The CIA briefed us on legal opinions, not on actual practices." End quote. She yanked a second document from the black folder. Madam Speaker, exactly 6 days after that disastrous press conference, your fellow staunch Democrat, the Director of Central Intelligence Leon Panetta, wrote a scathing letter to the United States Congress. This is a man who had honorably served as White House Chief of Staff to Bill Clinton. He had been proudly confirmed as CIA Director by Barack Obama. He possessed absolutely zero political motivation to contradict you. He aggressively contradicted you anyway. I am going to read his damning letter aloud. She held up the typed page for the cameras. Quote, "The CIA records currently in our possession clearly indicate that Speaker Pelosi was briefed on the enhanced interrogation techniques in exhaustive detail in September of 2002. The records are accurate. The records reflect the absolute truth." End quote. Signed, Leon Panetta, May 15, 2009. Tulsi slammed the document down onto the desk. Madam Speaker, you stood arrogantly at a podium inside this sacred building, directly in front of the flashing cameras, directly in front of the trusting American people, and you boldly lied to the entire country about whether you knew the United States government was brutally waterboarding detainees on your watch. The director of the Central Intelligence Agency, your own beloved party's chosen director, forcefully contradicted you on the permanent public record. You have never issued an apology. You have never corrected the public record. You have never, ever been held remotely accountable. The expansive hearing room was gripped by a silence vastly different from the quiet of the previous rounds. This was the crushing, suffocating silence of an audience that had never, until this very second, comprehended the full monstrous shape of the woman cowering in the witness chair. Tulsi's voice dropped to a menacingly low, furious register. Madam Speaker, you aggressively launched the historical impeachment of Donald Trump in 2019 on the self-righteous grounds that he simply could not be trusted to tell the truth to the American people. The man you repeatedly claimed could not be trusted never once lied about American torture. You did, on the permanent record, confirmed by your own party's sitting CIA director in 2009, 17 years ago, and you have never made it right. Suddenly, in the front row, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth stood up. He did not utter a single syllable. He walked slowly, heavily across the open well of the hearing room. He carried a single, profound object in his right hand. It was a pair of scuffed, polished military combat boots, standard military issue. A small white name tag had been carefully tied to the heavy laces with a piece of stark black ribbon. He placed the boots gently onto the well of the witness table, exactly 6 inches directly in front of Nancy Pelosi's face. He stood solemnly beside the boots. He did not look at Pelosi. He looked entirely at the chairman. Then Hegseth spoke, his voice carrying the quiet devastation of a battlefield graveyard. Madam Speaker, these boots belong to Sergeant Howard Liebengood of the United States Capitol Police. Sergeant Liebengood possessed a top-secret security clearance. He had thoroughly read the horrifying after-action reports of the Enhanced Interrogation Program back in 2007 when those very reports were briefed to Capitol Police senior personnel for protective intelligence purposes. His voice dropped to a whisper. On January 9, 2021, just 3 days after the traumatic assault on the Capitol, Sergeant Liebengood tragically took his own life. Exactly 6 days before he died, he tearfully told his wife, and I am directly quoting her heartbreaking account given to the Department of Defense in October of 2024, "I cannot understand how the powerful people who truly knew, did absolutely nothing." End quote. He didn't touch the boots. His grieving widow personally asked me to bring these boots here today. She said, and these are her exact, unedited words, "Let her see them." End quote. I have dutifully delivered them. Hegseth turned, walked slowly back to his chair, and sat down in heavy silence. Pelosi simply could not look at the boots. She was physically incapable. Her glassy eyes were fixed completely on the oak table. Her trembling hands were tightly hidden in her lap. And then the pearls. The fraying silk thread, heavily stressed after 5 grueling rounds of terrified twisting, finally gave out entirely. The silk snapped with a loud, incredibly audible crack. 26 heavy pearls cascaded violently onto the polished oak of the witness table. The first pearl hit with a loud clack, then the second, then the third. Then 100 horrifying milliseconds of absolute silence. Then 23 pearls shattered across the wood all at once. The terrifying sound picked up on the C-SPAN microphones was completely unlike any sound the historic network had ever broadcast in its existence. 26 pearls wildly rolling on hard oak. Some of them rolled mockingly toward Pelosi. Some of them rolled tragically toward the combat boots. 3 of them rolled completely off the sharp edge of the table. The high-def cameras flawlessly caught the first one, violently bouncing on the marble floor, then the second, then the third. Pelosi remained utterly paralyzed for 9 full seconds. Then she slowly brought her hands up and completely covered her ruined face. Senator Cotton allowed the devastating silence to run for 15 full, excruciating seconds. He then tapped his gavel incredibly softly. Not to demand order, the stunned room was already in perfect, terrified order. He tapped it merely to mark the solemn transition of history. The committee will stand in recess for 15 minutes. Madam Speaker, when we return, Director Gabbard will deliver her closing statement, and you will have the brief opportunity to respond. We are in recess. Bang. Pelosi did not stand. Her panicked staff rushed to the witness table to physically help her up. Schiff nervously stood, looked at her broken form, and immediately sat back down. He genuinely didn't know what to do. The pearls were scattered everywhere. A frantic young female aide dropped to her knees, using both hands and an empty manila envelope pulled from her tote bag to desperately gather the scattered jewels. She completely refused to make eye contact with the glaring cameras. The heavy combat boots remained exactly where Hegseth had placed them. Tulsi did not leave her chair. She didn't pick up her folders. She didn't check her cell phone. She simply sat with her hands calmly folded over her old combat journal, staring straight ahead, and waited. When the heavy gavel struck again, loudly signaling the end of the recess, Pelosi was seated back at the dreaded witness table. She had nervously changed her blouse. A panicked staffer had fetched a fresh one from a nearby office. The pearls were completely gone. Her hair had been hastily smoothed, her ruined makeup had been aggressively retouched, but the raw, puffy redness violently circling her eyes was impossible to hide from the unblinking lenses of the cameras. She had sobbed uncontrollably in the recess room. 3 of her most loyal former aides had openly wept with her. She was 85 years old, and she was sitting alone in that massive room in a terrifying way she had not experienced in 50 years of ruthless power. Adam Schiff was no longer sitting beside her at the table. He had been quietly replaced by her high-priced personal counsel, a private defense attorney dispatched from Williams and Connolly. Schiff now sat in the gallery, hiding in the second row, his head bowed deeply in shame. Director Gabbard, closing statement, Cotton announced. Tulsi stood up tall. She did not approach the witness table. She stood proudly at the DNI table, exactly 20 feet away from Pelosi, and threw her voice powerfully across the silent well of the hearing room. Madam Speaker, I came here today acting as the Director of National Intelligence under the explicit cross-examination authority granted by this body. I came here specifically to ask you about a partisan impeachment you aggressively launched in 2019, an impeachment based entirely on a whistleblower complaint manufactured using flimsy second-hand evidence and deeply politically biased witnesses. Exactly 3 weeks ago, I formally declassified those damning documents. The American people have finally read them. The entire fabricated case for that impeachment, Madam Speaker, has completely collapsed. She paused, letting the reality sink in. I did not come here with the intention of litigating your husband's criminal behavior, or your inexplicable wealth, or your ripped speech, or your toxic friendship with Joseph Biden, or the horrifying briefing you sat through in the dark basement of CIA headquarters in 2002. She paused again, the silence deafening. But you raised the question of credibility. Madam Speaker, in your aggressive opening statement, you confidently called me a Russian asset. You called me a traitor. You stated publicly that I should be rotting in a prison cell. You arrogantly weaponized the supposed credibility of your 40-year political career to completely discredit me before I could even ask a single question. She turned her body slightly, addressing the network cameras directly. The American people listening at home tonight are now fully able to weigh that reckless claim against your own husband's drunk driving with another woman in your car while you toasted to high society in Brussels. They can weigh it against the glaring difference between $3 million and $280 million accumulated on the exact same public salary. They can weigh it against the 11 ruthless days in July when you cold-bloodedly organized the political demise of a man who had wept and buried his own son in your arms, against the 4 sacred pages you spitefully tore in half on live television, simply because you could not bear the fact that the man standing at the podium had your name stitched on his red hat. Against the terrifying morning at Langley when you sat quietly through 95 brutal minutes of waterboarding briefings, only to stand in front of flashing cameras 7 years later and boldly lie about it to the nation, prompting your own party's CIA director to call you a liar on the permanent record. Her voice never rose into a scream. Its calmness was its power. Madam Speaker, I am not going to call you a Russian asset. I am not going to call you a fascist. I am not going to call you a death cult. I am going to give you the exact, precise label that the mountain of evidence inside this folder flawlessly supports. She lifted the empty manila envelope. You are a public servant who mysteriously became a massive private fortune. You are a sister who became a ruthless betrayer. You are a sworn guardian of the Constitution who violently tore the Constitution's most photographed page cleanly in half on live television. You are a sworn witness who lied directly to your own trusting people about the horrific torture conducted in their name. You are a speaker who completely ended an impeachment case 3 short weeks ago when the declassified documents proved unequivocally that the entire case was built entirely on a vicious lie. She gently set the empty envelope down. Madam Speaker, you desperately wanted to put Donald Trump on trial today. Donald Trump is not here. You are. And in just 2 short hours, I have brilliantly made the definitive case against him using your own scattered pearls, your husband's humiliating mugshot, your sprawling Napa winery, the freezing veteran on Market Street, the joyful wedding photograph from June 17th, 1977, the 4 torn pages from February 4th, 2020, the classified briefing log from September 4th, 2002, and Sergeant Liebengood's boots. She stood absolutely still. I proudly quote the sacred text upon which I took my solemn oath as Director of National Intelligence, the Bhagavad Gita Satyameva Jayate. Truth alone triumphs. Tulsi sat down. For 5 incredible seconds, the massive hearing room produced absolutely no sound. Then, the grieving woman confined to the wheelchair in the back row, Serena Liebengood, the widow, slowly, painfully stood up. The overhead lighting caught the gold pin gleaming on her chest. Immediately, the hardened veterans sitting in the second row stood up. The entire viewing gallery stood. The cynical press corps stood. Shockingly, half of Pelosi's own progressive supporters slowly stood up. There was absolutely no applause. Applause is highly inappropriate inside a Senate hearing room. There was only the profound, silent standing. 300 people, dead, silent, on their feet. The ultimate, appropriate honor for a brave witness who had unflinchingly delivered the brutal truth under oath. Adam Schiff, cowering in the second row with his head bowed, did not stand. Pelosi's trembling hands remained hidden in her lap. She did not dare look up. Chairman Cotton patiently waited until the silent standing ovation had completely run its historical course. He then tapped the wooden gavel. The committee will officially receive Director Gabbard's submitted documents into the permanent public record. Madam Speaker, you are hereby dismissed. This hearing is adjourned. Bang. The room slowly emptied. The boots remained sitting on the polished witness table. The 4 glossy photographs from February of 2020 had been carefully removed by the court clerk to be preserved for the official record. The spilled water on the table had eventually dried, leaving behind a faint, ghostly stain in the exact shape of a child's pink dress. That evening, C-SPAN completely shattered its single-day historical viewership record by 1100. The haunting image of the Liebengood boots, captured brilliantly by a wire photographer in the empty well of the hearing room, dominated the front page of every single newspaper across the entire country by the following morning. Pelosi's scrambling office issued a terrified, brief statement at 6:15 the next morning. The Speaker remains entirely focused on her legacy work and will not respond to partisan political theater. She immediately canceled 4 straight weeks of highly anticipated public appearances. Her panicked staff completely stopped responding to all press inquiries by Thursday. Adam Schiff had cowardly ignored reporters for 72 straight hours. On the crucial 4th day, his highly suspicious financial disclosures were conveniently leaked to Politico. He immediately issued a statement announcing he was officially retiring from politics at the end of his current term. Dr. Jill Biden posted exactly one word on social media at 3:42 inches the morning, exactly 6 hours after the explosive hearing concluded. Truth. She did not post anything else for the rest of the week. At 7:00 the next morning, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth posted a single profound photograph on the official Department of Defense account. The chilling image depicted the empty wooden witness table, the scattered pearls, the combat boots, and the dried water stain. There was absolutely no caption. The following Monday, Senator Cotton formally announced that the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence would aggressively reopen the 2002 CIA briefing investigation, operating with the full, willing cooperation of former Director Leon Panetta, who enthusiastically agreed to testify. Janiyah Davis's mother granted a single emotional interview to the Philadelphia Inquirer that following Sunday. She confirmed that her 10-year-old daughter had watched the explosive hearing live. When the reporter softly asked what little Janiyah had said, the mother wiped away a tear and answered. She said, "The lady cried." She said, "Maybe the lady is sorry now." I told her, "Baby, sometimes sorry comes way too late." Tulsi Gabbard quietly returned to the sprawling office of the Director of National Intelligence. She granted absolutely 0 press interviews. As for the pearls, they were quietly swept up and collected by the Capitol janitors at the very end of the day shift, 26 inches total. They were unceremoniously dumped into a small plastic evidence bag and officially handed over to the Senate Sergeant-at-Arms. Their final disposition remains entirely absent from the public record. There was no formal expulsion. There was no tearful resignation. There were absolutely no criminal charges filed. There were only the cold, hard records. And the records simply do not unredact.